Good morning and welcome to our fifth webinar for the collection management course. You are very much welcome, and we're so glad that you were able to join us. I just want to get started by introducing our panelists, and then we can get started with the webinar. And before that, we'll do the guidelines. So today we have, as usual, we have Michelle Hamer, the NSCF lead, who will be presenting, as well as Chanel Ribeiro, the NSCF project manager, as well as Audrey Ndaba, who is the NSCF collections management coordinator. And myself, I am Fulopero Tambani, and I am the science communication officer. We are the ones who will be taking you through the webinar today. Let's go to the next slide. We just need to go through some guidelines before we get started. So we are asking that you keep your contributions in this webinar helpful and considerate of everyone in here. So the host, as well as other participants. Let's use kind language. Let's be nice to each other. Let's be kind. You can use the chat box to say hello. I see you've already started. So thank you for getting us started. Good morning to everyone. I see there's Geoffrey, there's Maxine, there's Prinavin, Christina, Gabrielle, Mahlori, Henry, Derek, Daniela. Thank you for getting us started. Maggie is there, Renee, Lemmy, Geraldine. Good morning to everyone. Please continue greeting each other as we get started with the webinar. You can use the Q&A box to put your questions there. So as we go through the webinar, you might find that you have some questions that arise. Put those questions in the Q&A box. Also, just so that you don't forget them. And we'll get them answered at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to answering your questions, please do put them in the webinar link. By webinar link, we mean where the recording will be placed, which is on our YouTube channel, as well as on our Facebook page. So you can put your questions there also if you see that they're not answered here. Just to remind you of where you can find all information regarding the course, you can go to nscf.org.za. If you go to the resources tab, you'll find collections management, and that's where all the information is. And videos, background information about the course, the assignments, everything, you'll find it there. So to get us started will be Michelle Hamer. She will get started with the contents of the webinar. Michelle?
All right, good morning, everybody, and thanks, Fulu, for that. So today we're going to be looking at emergencies and disasters and how to plan for them. So they happen, emergencies and disasters happen in museums, libraries, galleries, universities, and government buildings. They're often impacted by fire, floods, explosions, theft, vandalism, collapse of structures. And in many cases, these are old buildings. They're often not very well maintained, and there's lots of flammable materials in them. And they often may not be the target, but they're in the path of protest action. And so they're very vulnerable from that perspective. So we talk about emergency and disaster, but what's the difference between the two of them? So the definition of an emergency is when it's an unanticipated or threatening event that requires immediate action. And a disaster is when an emergency gets out of control. So if you don't, you're not able to control it, and it's usually a large-scale calamity, and you need to do something immediately. So often a disaster results in significant loss, damage, or destruction. And you can get two kinds of disasters, natural disasters and man-made disasters. So we'll look at some examples of those. Right, next slide. So I think often people who work in these institutions just hope that there is never an emergency or that there is never a disaster. And I think it's easier to just think it won't happen than to confront it. And globally, if you look on the internet, you can see all the emergencies and all the disasters that have hit museums and other heritage institutions. So this in Croatia was last year in July. They had an earthquake which caused structural damage, and then they had this massive storm and the collections were flooded. So this is natural disasters, earthquake, and then flooding after a massive storm. So those are natural disasters. Next slide. And then I'm sure that you've heard about that massive explosion that happened in Beirut in Lebanon last year. And it rocked the city very badly, and the National Museum was badly damaged. And that's an example. It was because of a chemical store explosion. So on the port, a big warehouse exploded, and so that's a man-made disaster. All right, and they are opening slowly, they're getting assistance to help. And then this is one from last month, flooding in Germany. So in a wealthy, very first world country, they had floods that damaged archives, soaking historic documents in mud. So it can happen anywhere. This was a natural disaster. Next slide. And then fire again in Brazil. So you'll have heard of museums burning in Brazil. This is a recent one last year in July. The University Museum of Natural History and Botanical Gardens. So this is from the article. The building lacked proper maintenance. Its electrical wiring was redone in 2013, which is not that long ago. And the last inspection by the fire department was carried out in October 2018. So for us, that would be quite recently. But a month before that, an independent museums task force had visited the site and pointed out irregularities, such as the absence of a fire inspection report and fire and panic safety protocols. And they had a plan for safeguarding the museum in case of an emergency, but it was not put into practice. The fire, this was probably a natural disaster. Next slide. And this is the big fire in the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro. And most of the museum's collection was lost in this fire. So it was devastating. And it was caused by overheating air conditioning units. And the fire started in the evening. And the museum smoke detector control system wasn't activated for some reason. There were no sprinklers or hoses. The security cameras were inefficient, and there was no fire suppression to contain the flames. So it burned. So this is again fire. I don't know whether you would consider this as a natural or a man-made disaster. It's probably a natural disaster. Next slide. And if you look, it's more fire, fire, fire. Destroying Notre Dame in Paris, you'll have heard of that. Berlin's a new facility, the Humboldt Forum. They had a fire there. It didn't destroy it, but it was controlled. The Natural History Museum in Delhi, in India, destroyed by fire. And something like the Glasgow School of Art, second fire. So you can see fire happens frequently in these institutions. Next slide. And if you think, well, that happens overseas, it doesn't happen to us in South Africa, that's not the case. So everybody knows about the UCT wildfire that gutted the library. And this was written in the article. So somebody said, we saw water streaming down the Pearson building. The roof appeared to be destroyed by fire. And the building, which is home to the Bolus Herbarium Library, and huge collections of samples. And luckily, we know that the Bolus Herbarium was not severely impacted, but it so could have been, so close. Next slide. And if you think that's an isolated case, if you look, there are other places where there have been disasters. So the art gallery in Pietermaritzburg flooded. They had to evacuate all the art stored there. There was an attempted robbery at Museum Africa in Johannesburg, and then a flood resulting and damage to the collections there. The roof of the Johannesburg Art Gallery was stolen because it was copper, and then there was massive flooding. If you think about it, there was the municipal workers that torched the museum, the Bloemfontein City Hall. That was in 2017. So it's ongoing, these disasters. Next slide. And then very recently, in July this year, there was the looting and destruction of government buildings and various other buildings. In 2016, there was the burning of the UK's Law Library by protesting students. And they said they've now they've housed the rare collections in a better, secure facility. And they say that there were disaster management plans in place. So I think that what this shows is that these things do happen, and they happen regularly, and it means that all of our institutions and collections are vulnerable to disasters and emergencies. We can't ignore that fact. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'll hand over to Chanel now, just to take us through this exercise, just to get people thinking about disasters and emergencies. Thanks, Chanel.
Thanks, Michelle. So we're going to do an interactive activity together on our Google Drive Jamboard. Some of you will remember the Jamboard from our last webinar, and I'm going to put the link to the Jamboard in the chat, so if you can please click on it. And then I'll also share my screen so that we are able to see your contributions in real time. Just going to stop sharing for a minute. I'm posting the link now, if you can open it so long. And then I'll just explain how to populate. So there's the Jamboard on the screen. Please don't move things around yet. Just maybe minimize your screen when you open it, but so that I can just show you on my screen how to populate and what we want you to do. So share examples of emergencies or disasters that happened in your institution. They can be recent or historical, and try and include the approximate year if you know it. So you'll see there's like a column for emergency, if it was an emergency, and then there's a column for if it was a disaster, and then whether it was a man-made disaster or a natural disaster. So what you need to do is go on the side, on the left-hand side here, you'll see all the controls. And the fourth one is a sticky note. So if you click on sticky note, it pops up. You can change the color if you want to, and just post what happened. So whether a fire or a flood at your institution name and the approximate year, then you say save. And then you go and drag your sticky notes where you want it. Is it an emergency? Is it a disaster? Was it man-made or natural? Okay, so I'm just going to delete this one. And then we're going to give you a few minutes to populate. If you don't understand anything, just post it in the chat and we'll try and answer you. So you can go ahead and populate with your sticky notes. And remember to put in your institution if you want to, and also the year that it happened.
Okay, I'm going to come in here, Chanel. So I think it's great to see all of these things coming up, and so we can get a sense of emergencies that institutions have had to deal with. So just think about it. If something happens and it threatens the collections, but you control it, it's an emergency. If something happens and it's got into the collection and done damage and you haven't been able to control it, then it's a disaster. So just think carefully about that distinction. So if you have a water leak, it's an emergency, but you get in there and you fix it before it gets to the collections, then that's an emergency that you've controlled. It hasn't become a disaster. If you don't control that water leak and it floods the collection, it's a disaster. So just look at what's come up there and think about, rethink, is it an emergency and we controlled it? Or is it a disaster that actually got in the collection and we couldn't control it once it was there?
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I think let's just read some of them. So we have quite a lot of emergencies here, like the accidental release of the fire suppression system. There was a storm in near one of the collections, water leaks, aircon leaks, a mold outbreak due to faulty climate control, a fire at the song that was quickly contained, and student protests. The examination hall was burnt, but the real threat is that other university buildings could easily be burnt. And then under disasters, we have the fire at UCT in 2021. And there's a substation theft that led to extra current, damaging lights and aircons. It could have moved to a fire. There was also a lightning strike that surged equipment. So a lot of things that can happen. I'm going to just stop share here. Thank you for all these examples. It gives us a good idea of what can happen. So I think with all those examples, it shows us that it's very important to have a plan, because disasters will happen. And you can try and solve, you can't try and solve it when it has already happened. A plan is essential because the impact on the collections will be very quick, and it could result in the total loss of the collections. And an immediate and appropriate response is essential. If you delay the response or do the wrong thing, the consequences are likely to be very significant. So let's have a look, where does this plan, this emergency response plan, fits into our overall risk management process. If you remember from our last webinar, we presented the 5 stages of control for risks. So you have the avoid the cause of the risk, the block the agents of deterioration, put a barrier between the object and the source, detect the agents of deterioration. And if we deal with emergencies and disasters, sometimes the only option is to respond. So to go back to your plan, do the preparation, and carry out effective actions. And then after that, to recover from the damages and the losses. That is, if everything else has failed, you also have to have a recovery plan. Okay, now we're going to do another interactive exercise. So I'm going to launch a poll, and please tell us, does your institution have an emergency or disaster plan? Yes, it includes the collections. Yes, but I don't think it covers the collections. No, I've never heard of it, or I'm not sure. So I'm launching the poll. If you can please complete it, I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to do that, and then we can have a look at the results. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So I'm sharing the results now. So 34% said yes, we do have a plan and it covers the collections. 2% said no, and then the last 2, so yes, but I don't think it covers the collections, and I'm not sure. So with that, I think it's like, if you don't think it covers the collections, or you're not sure, then it's like you don't have a plan, even if it is a document sitting somewhere, because you don't know about it. You won't know what to do when there is a disaster or an emergency. You won't know who to contact, who's responsible. So it is kind of the same as not having one. And yeah, it would be good to find out if you do have one and see what it covers. Okay, thanks. I'm going to hand over to Audrey now.
Thanks, Chanel. So next up is for us to know what to do in case of an emergency or a disaster. If there is a fire in your institution or in the collection room itself, do you know what to do? If the collection room gets flooded, whether it's a burst pipe or it's due to the storm, would you know what to do? Or would anyone else who is there, besides the people who directly work in the collection, will they know what to do? Explosion in the building. Will anyone in the building know what to do? If the roof or part of the building has collapsed, does the staff know what to do? So do you know who is responsible for making decisions or for calling emergency services? Because during an emergency, there is usually a lot of chaos and panic. So it's also very important to know who does what, because you cannot have the entire institution or the entire people who are there at that day all trying to call for emergency services. And if everyone is running around in panic, there'll be duplication, obviously. There'll be confusion, and critical actions will end up not being taken, because I may assume Chanel has already covered it, and Chanel might assume definitely Michelle has taken care of it, and it ends up not getting done. And the outcome will obviously not be good. There could be injuries or loss of life or unnecessary loss of critical collections. So it is important that we definitely do have a plan in place. Next slide, please. So an emergency response or a disaster plan. The first step to have is to have a documented plan for emergencies or disasters. And this should be developed according to your collections or your building or the threats to your institutions. A generic may be a start, but then if it is not inclusive or specifically covering the collection, it obviously needs to be updated. I see Christina posted that there could be one in place, but if it doesn't cover everything or it's not comprehensive enough, it is just as good as not being there. That's why it should be developed to cover the specific collection or threats in the particular institution. And the plan must be up to date, and it should be a living document. As we go through the practices, the drills and the training, you will always figure something out that you may have missed. So this should be a living document in that sense. Everyone who works in the collection should be involved in the development of that plan so that everyone knows and understands. And this will also, in a way, be helping us or everyone be familiar with what to do or where to find what, and just the procedures in general. So there should be regular training and practices, as I have suggested. This is where because we'll never be able to get through all the things that we have on paper on the day of the actual emergency. So even though the practice will not be the same as the emergency, but to go through it will help us, because there'll be less chaos, because you'll be anticipating things. From reading and going through the drills, you'll know that there'll be smoke, and so you will be prepared going in there. And even though during the training you will not have smoke, so you don't know how it will actually affect you, but going in there, anticipating there will be smoke, anticipating you'll be sleeping because it might be wet on the floors, etc. Those things would be very helpful. Globally, it is accepted that because collection institutions are custodians of irreplaceable collections, being prepared for an emergency disaster is critical. So whether you are a big institution or a small institution, by virtue of you holding irreplaceable collections, we all should have an emergency plan in place. Next slide, please. What should be in your emergency plan? So there should be details of the emergency or the disaster teams. Those are the people that will be in charge during an emergency and during those drills and the simulations, etc. So everyone's position and role and responsibility should be there and should be clearly indicated so that a person knows that my role is to do 1, 2, 3, and I hand over to Fulu, who takes it from 4, 5, 6, etc. Also, it should include the decision-making and leadership during the emergency or the disaster itself, who reports to who makes what decisions and what instructions, or to even know where the instructions come from and who authorizes the different actions that should be taken. Because, as I said, during an emergency, there will obviously be chaos. And so it is very important that we have all these things in place and we know them so that we at least minimize or reduce the chaos. So you should have your contact list and the inventory list of the prioritized collections, what collection to take first and where to put it. Is the triage room ready? And what supplies do we have for a flood emergency? What supplies do we need for fire? Can we even try to put out the fire? All those things. So that is all the things that should be in your emergency or disaster response plan. And obviously the most important and the usually overlooked is the training and the training schedule. So it is important that even though we have these things on paper, we practice them, we read about them, even if it's over the table, we cannot be expected to always be running around pretending now there is fire, now there's a flood. But sometimes these can be done around the table and it can be discussed and people will still get the same experience and knowledge and expectation of what to do during an actual event. Next slide, please. So an example of an emergency response team. First of all, there should be an emergency committee. So this could be, because our institutions have different structures, this could be the head of security if there's such a person in your institution, or a building manager. In some instances, it will be the director or the HOD of the institution. In some, it might be health and safety officers, but these are the people who will be in charge of managing their disaster, and so they are responsible for limiting access to the area and letting everyone know and maintaining contacts from in the institution, from up, down in the chain, etc. So these will be the people an emergency is reported to, and then they will know what to do. Next slide, please. So then there will be the emergency response team. There should be a recovery team leader. These are the people who work directly with those emergency preparedness managers, the first people that I mentioned in the previous slide. So they work closely with that committee and they report to them regarding the planning and responses, and then they go back and report to the entire team now of people who will be in charge of moving the collections, of recording the collections, of all the activities that are there to be taken in order to try and save the collection. And the welfare of the team and communicating the needs to the emergency preparedness managers is also the responsibility of the recovery team leader. Next slide, please. So besides the recovery team leader and the emergency preparedness managers, so this is the group that contains either the collection managers or the collection officers, whoever is naturally based at the collection itself, who knows the collection most. because who better than them to be the recorders and the movers and the packers, because they are the ones who are most familiar with the collection. So if, for instance, there is a collection that is a priority, they will be the first people to know that the priority collection is over there. If there is a collection that is hazardous and should be taken first in terms of, in case of a fire, if it's obviously still not on fire. So these are the guys who would know. So yeah, they can, as I have mentioned, serve to be the recorders, the movers, the packers, and you should also, well, the entire team should also have the information of who the movers are and who to contact, etc.
Thank you, Audrey. Let's go to the general emergency disaster response actions. Now, as what I was saying was that, as Audrey mentioned earlier, it's the responses will be collection specific or your institution specific. So it's not a blanket kind of action. So each institution, each collection will have its own response plan. But just to go through a few steps that you can take that are more general actions. The first one is that you can isolate the affected area, just so that you don't do more damage. And then you need to retrieve the emergency supply cart. So whatever is your emergency kit, you will take that, and you need to contact appropriate emergency organizations like the fire department, the ambulances, the police, whatever you have as an emergency contact. And also the area support institutions. So if you have other institutions close to you that can help you, you contact those. These can be other collections institutions, or they can be government departments, or whatever is relevant to you. This will help you to move things faster or take whatever action that you need to do to take faster, which will in turn help you to save the collections and maybe the buildings and storage. If it's safe to do so, you can assess the damage. But if it's not safe, you leave it and do what is necessary for you to do at that time, and with the time that you have in place, with the time that you have at that moment. Then you can initiate relocation, evacuation, as well as maybe salvaging whatever you can, or whatever measures for the collection. And then you need, this is the most crucial part, maybe not the most crucial, but you need to at least think of doing this. You need to document everything that happens. So you can take photos of the damage, you can take photos of whatever the situation is at that time, even as you go through the steps of trying to move or relocate the collections, as you try to mitigate, to respond to the emergency. You need to document that. And you can take notes, you can take photographs, but I think photographs are the most effective because they are physical proof, they are visual proof. But of course, as you're going through the emergency, you need to be thinking fast. So whatever you can think of to help you document the situation, please do that. Next slide. In terms of staff training for the plan, we know that all staff members need to know and understand their roles and responsibilities that they play in case of a disaster. So this means that each and every person has to know that if there's a fire that's coming, if there's a fire that takes place, my role is to do this and this and this. And it's also important to know other staff members' roles. So you'll know that which colleague of yours is responsible for what. This will help you to move fast and to not be too much confused, because as chaos is happening, people can be confused very quickly. Staff must be trained in order to understand how to respond in case of different types of disasters. So if there's a water disaster, your staff need to know that this is how we act, this is how we respond. And if it's a fire, they need to know how to respond to a fire. So the different types of disasters will have different kinds of responses by staff members. So training is very important. Managers and incident recorders must be trained on how to properly document and investigate incidents before being assigned such tasks. So this is just reiterating the importance of training. So it's not just staff members that need to be trained, even managers and those that are responsible for recording the incidents, they also need to be trained, and they also need to be trained on how to document the disasters and the actions that are taking place. All training given must be recorded and officialized by both the trainers and the trainees' signatures. So it's not just about a trainer coming and giving a training. There has to be proof that also the trainees were there and they have signed off that they did receive the training, because it's such an important training. Next slide. Some of the important points that you need to think of, or you need to consider, is collaboration and development of strategic partnerships. This is important in that, so you need to be developing relationships. It's either with local first responders like fire departments, the police, security companies, and such kinds. Try to have a relationship with them. When you have a relationship, it's going to be much easier for you to get them to act as fast as you need them to act. And if they know, especially if you brief them, if they know just how important those collections are, they will obviously act very fast. You can build relationships with neighboring institutions. This can be other collections institutions, like I said before. It can also be other organizations that are not necessarily collections organizations, but they can be government departments, they can be whatever field, but the workforce is what's really needed. And another important thing is that they also need to get the training for disasters, because we all know that our collections are quite fragile. It's not everyone who knows how to handle them. So as they get that training, it's going to be best for the collections. You need to have emergency disaster simulations and drills. This is going to help everyone in the institution to kind of practice that if this kind of a disaster is going to happen, or an emergency is going to happen, this is how we need to act. It's easier to remember something that you do physically than something that is just on paper. you connect better with what you have done than what you have just seen written on a piece of paper. It's critical to test the plan. So it's not just having the plan on paper, but testing it to see if it works. You'll also, as you do that, you also recognize some things that are missing or some things that you need to amend, which will help you to have a better plan or a plan of action. This should be repeated regularly. So new staff members need to be involved. Revisions to the plan need to be taken or done, and just getting everyone familiar with what to do. If you can post in the chat and let us know, when was your last emergency or disaster drill? Post in the chat and let us know that when was your last drill or emergency or disaster simulation. I see Cameron says in 2019. Okay, thanks, Cameron. Anyone else? Derek says before COVID. Okay, understandably so. Daniela says November 2019. So it seems like it for all three, it's before COVID. 2019, Geraldine, before COVID. 3 months ago, Maxine at KZN Herbarium. Okay. All right. If you want to let us know, please go ahead. August 2021. That's very recent. By Eunice. Petrol from ARC says before COVID, before the lockdown. So it seems like most institutions haven't done drills since COVID. All right, thank you for that. Gosinati says early this year. All right. So you need to also have important contacts, evacuation plans need to be displayed in key positions in the institutions, and they also need to be reviewed regularly. I want to just emphasize on the displaying of evacuation plans in key positions. So everyone needs to know and find it easily, just in case there's an emergency. So those things are very important. Important contacts also include people in your institution that need to be notified, as well as those collaborating partners and the emergency departments like the fire department, the police, etc. What happens now during COVID? We have seen that most people haven't been doing the drills since we had COVID. Do plans need to be reviewed and amended to deal with lockdowns? Of course, maybe those plans wouldn't be easily done with COVID and with everyone having to physically distance from each other, wearing masks. Does that affect our drills or our emergency plans? And like staff working on rotations, what do we do about the drills and practice sessions? I think this is something that needs to be discussed, also seeing that people haven't been doing those drills. I will stop here. I'm not sure if it's Michelle who's coming back here. Yes, thank you.
Yes, it's me. Thanks, Fulu. Okay, so we've seen what should be in an emergency response plan, and it can be, if you do it for the whole institution and you make sure that there's exact details of how to respond in the case of different types of emergencies or disasters, It's quite a big document. It's probably a file. And that can be very difficult to access all the relevant information quickly when you need it. And so what a lot of organizations globally are doing is they're having these pocket emergency response plan. So this is really just a summary of the most critical points all on one sheet of paper that you can keep in your pockets, in your wallet, in a place where you can grab it very quickly and you can get hold of the most important points in an emergency or disaster. So this is what we're going to look at now, a pocket emergency response plan. All right, next slide. And there is an example in the manual, in the NECF Collection Management and Curation Manual. And if you look on the internet, there's examples for a lot of different institutions that have developed them. This can be an A4 sheet of paper, and on one side you have all your communication. So who are all the people that need to be contacted? So within your institution, who are the contacts? And then in your building, so all the emergency contact details. Put that all down on one sheet of paper. Next slide, please. And then on the other side of that piece of paper, you put all your actions. So what are the immediate things you need to do? So step one, step points, you can see it's very, very summarized. And it tells you about your immediate response, what needs to be assessed, what needs to be communicated. And then if you move on to collection salvage, what are the critical points to do? Which are your priority collections? And then also for if it's a major disaster, then what are the what's the command system? So how do you deal with that? And then doing a situation report. So there is everything summarized in your hand, and so you can know what to do. And everybody can carry this around and keep it in a very accessible place rather than trying to get through a big fat file while the building is burning. All right, next slide. So I think those are very useful. And then this is a salvage wheel. So this is shown in the manual. And there are also examples on the internet. And so this is what this wheel tells you is what are the immediate salvage steps that need to be taken. Because you might need to do something quickly for some specimens that have been damaged in some way, but in other cases, doing that same thing could be very wrong and do more damage. So again, having all the information that you need in your hand is really useful. All right, next slide. So, it might seem like there's a lot of different things that need to be done for these plans, and it might seem quite overwhelming if you've got nothing or you've got something that doesn't specify the collections. There's a lot of resources out there. So if you look on the internet, you'll find guides and examples from other museums around the world. And then in the manual, there is a lot of detailed information for how to deal with specific emergencies and disasters and what to do to salvage different kinds of specimens. So how do you dry them if they've got wet? How do you prevent mold? And what do you do for fire damage? What do you record if you're recording moving collections out of an area where there's been a disaster? So we didn't have time to go through everything in a webinar, and it's also difficult to absorb all of that, but it's all there. There is the information that's accessible either in the manual or on the internet. Okay, next slide. So I think that's the end of the webinar, and we hope that it's highlighted the importance of having these plans, detailed, documented, easy to follow, simple, and very workable, that you have practices and emergency response drills are not necessarily just evacuation plans. So I know that that's the traditional thing. You have your evacuation plan and you do that, you test that, and that's great. That is important. But have you practiced what you would do to save the collections in terms of a fire or a flood? You know, have you got your emergency team and they practice what would you do and talk it through on the ground, looking through the steps in your plan? So, you know, it just shows all the things that need to be done. And this is really one of the most critical aspects of being responsible for these collections, is having these plans, having them practiced, having the staff trained, knowing what to do. So in our next discussion forum, which is next week on Wednesday, we're going to also spend more time talking about emergency response and disaster preparedness plans. What we're asking for is some volunteers to do presentations, short presentations of 5 to 7 minutes. Tell us about an emergency. So it may not have been a massive disaster, but it might have been an emergency, or it could be a disaster in a collection where you work. Tell us what happened and what you did and what the outcome was, and any lessons that we learned from that. So how did that help you to be better prepared? Or, and it doesn't, you know, we're not only talking about fire or floods. It can be like the one example that was there, shelf collapses, all the bottles, the polytops shatter on the floor. You have a mixture of labels, specimens, ethanol, broken glass. What do you do? So it can be that's a disaster. Or if you want to give a presentation on key aspects of your institution's emergency response plan. So tell us, where do you put your evacuation plans? What does your emergency cart look like? What are your priority collections? And anything else you have in place to respond to an emergency or disaster. Or you can share your experience about developing an emergency response plan. If you've been part of a team that's done this, how did you go about it? And what were some of the challenges? So there's 3 options for giving a presentation at the discussion forum. Like I said, it's short, 5 to 7 minutes. So we can take 3 to 5 of these presentations. So please send me, Michelle, your offer to volunteer. And if you can do that by the end of today, that would be great. If we don't get volunteers, then we're going to just identify people and beg them to give presentations. So it would be really nice to hear from Dean, from Bolus Herbarium, to share what they did after the fire at UCT. It would be nice to hear from somebody at the National Herbarium about what happened when the roof blew off. Anybody who can remember back to 2008, what did you do? You know, so it would really be good. This isn't, we're not assessing what you did. We just want to hear and we learn from it. All right, so that'll be the discussion forum. We'll also spend some time just talking, and it's an opportunity to ask questions if you are working on an emergency response plan. Okay, next slide, please. So just, this is for the people who are registered to do the course. This is assignment 5. So the first thing is to say, does your institution have an emergency or disaster response plan? Look at it. If it does it cover collections? So are there details about what to do if collections are impacted? If it does, then you can use that plan to produce a pocket emergency response plan. And you can also identify gaps or outdated information in the emergency plan and update it. So you're giving your institution some assistance. If you don't have a plan, or you have a plan that doesn't refer to collections, then you can develop a pocket response plan from scratch. So I think it's a bit too much work to do the whole plan just as an assignment, but of course we do encourage all the institutions to do it. So we will put these templates, and we'll put the information up on the NECF website under the course materials. And just to say, so for the people who are registered for the course, there this is the 5th assignment that's been allocated now. And then we have the last webinars for this year at the end of October. So the 27th of October is the last webinar, and the 3rd of November is the last discussion forum. And the topic there is health and safety in the collections. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pause for the year until the second half of January. And that's a chance, that time in November and maybe early December, early January is a chance for people to catch up if you're behind schedule with the assignments. And then we're suggesting that all the first 5 assignments are submitted at the end of January. We'll assess them and give you feedback, and then you can resubmit them at the end of the course. And all of these changes, you know, things that we've put in place now, we'll circulate a notice about this. But it came out of the last check-in session that we had earlier this month, talking to the people who attended it and getting a sense of where they are and the struggle that some of them are having with keeping up with assignments and just needing some time to focus on them. So we'll circulate that. All right, and with that, we've come to the end of the webinar today. We hope that you'll join us next week. If there are any questions or answers, you're welcome to put them into the Q&A. I see there's one here. Yeah, so is the plan for the assignment still to do 15 to 18 assignments? We only need to do 10 of them. So you will need to do 10 assignments. And I think that there'll probably only be, about 14 that are presented, but you only need to do 10 of them. Yeah. Okay, any other questions about emergency response planning? Yeah, we hope that you will join us next week. There was quite an interesting comment from, I think it was, somebody said, surely we must look after people before we look after the collections. If there's a disaster, of course. So yes, I mean, you're not going to risk people's lives by trying to save the collections. And that's part of having your plan so that you know, you may not need to evacuate everybody for every emergency or every kind of disaster. When would you do it? When would you not do it? And, saving the collections will only come once you know that people's lives are not at risk. So we will definitely look at that more in the health and safety webinar at the end of October. Today we were really focusing much more on the collections. Good job, good point. Okay, so if there's nothing else, thank you, Fulu. Thank you, Chanel. Thank you, Audrey, and thank you to everybody for joining us today for the webinar. We hope that you did learn something new from it. Thanks.